Let go of me. The harsh, shrill shout rang out, so piercing that Jordan Thompson jumped. A beam of flashlight swept directly into his face, causing him to instinctively squint. Before he could process what was happening, a strong force slammed into his back, pushing him forward. His hands were immediately twisted behind him, the pain shooting through his wrists. A cold voice came close to his ear, carrying the sharp scent of cigarettes. "You're under arrest for resisting an officer." Jordan froze, his breath quickening. "I didn't do anything," he shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the clicking sound of handcuffs tightening around his wrists. Sharp pain shot up his arms as the cold metal cut into his skin. Around him, murmurs began to rise. A woman in the crowd pulled out her phone, holding it up to record the scene. "He didn't resist," a voice of protest shouted from behind, but the officers ignored it. Why were they doing this? What were they hiding? Jordan was dragged roughly toward the patrol car, the flashing lights reflecting in his wide, terrified eyes. The officer's hand pressed hard on his shoulder, so forcefully that Jordan felt as if his bones were about to snap. Amid the shouting and the wailing sirens, one thought flashed through his mind: Victoria. Only she could save him now. But would she make it in time? What would happen when the truth came to light? Stay tuned for the dramatic continuation of this story, and don't forget to hit subscribe so you don't miss the shocking twist to come. Victoria Hayes walked through the towering gates of Fulton County Courthouse, feeling as if an invisible boulder was weighing down on her shoulders. The icy chill of the early morning did little to ease the tension that enveloped her. Whispers and the constant click of cameras filled the air as she made her way up the high steps where the fate of Jordan would be decided. The press had gathered early, a crowd of reporters jostling for position, microphones thrust in her face, their questions relentless. "Victoria, what do you think will happen in court today? Do you believe your brother is innocent? Do you have anything to say about the prosecutor's charge?" Flashes of light from cameras flickered nonstop, highlighting every line of tension in her face. But Victoria didn't stop, didn't answer, didn't care. All the sounds around her seemed to be drowned out by one image in her mind: Jordan Thompson, her brother, handcuffed and sitting in the courtroom. Once inside, the air grew stifling and cold, the atmosphere heavy with discomfort. The vast room, with its dark wood benches and high ceiling, felt even more oppressive under the harsh glow of fluorescent lights. The sound of Victoria's high heels echoed steadily on the wooden floor, but she didn't pay them any mind. There, at the table, sat Jordan, the gleaming handcuffs reflecting the light like a stark symbol of injustice. His hands rested on the table, stiff, motionless, neither trembling nor full of life. His eyes, once full of light and resolve, now held nothing but resignation, a gaze that spoke of someone who already knew what fate awaited him. Victoria suppressed the surge of anger rising in her chest. She couldn't let it control her now. She glanced around at the jury. Some were staring at Jordan as if searching for a sign to prove his guilt. Others seemed indifferent, their eyes glazed over as if they were simply completing another tedious task. None of them cared about the person sitting in front of them. To them, this was just another trial among hundreds, nothing special, nothing worth noting. But to Victoria, this was a battle she could not afford to lose. The large door swung open with a resounding bang, and the sound echoed through the entire courtroom, instantly drawing every eye to the entrance. The air immediately became heavy, thick with tension, as if an invisible weight had settled over the room, pressing down on everyone inside. The silence that followed was almost suffocating, as though the room itself held its breath, waiting for what was to come. Judge Richard Coleman stepped into the room, moving with a slow, deliberate pace. His every step carried the weight of authority, as if the very ground beneath him had been made to bend to his will. He wasn't in a rush, didn't need to make any announcement. His mere presence was enough to silence the entire courtroom. He was a man beyond his 60s, his silver hair combed neatly, his face lined with the deep creases of years spent exercising absolute power, not wisdom. The harsh, unyielding features of his face bore not the marks of experience, but the indelible signs of a man who had long stopped believing in fairness. His eyes were cold, sharp as daggers, sweeping over the room with an air of finality, as if each person present were simply another piece in his game to be judged, discarded, or manipulated at his whim. Coleman wasn't just a judge. He was the architect of fates, the one who held the power to decide who would live or die by the choices he made. And everyone in this room knew it. His reputation stretched far beyond the courthouse where he had presided over hundreds of cases. But what made Coleman infamous wasn't his long career. It was his tendency to approach every case with the belief that the law existed not as an absolute, impartial set of rules, but as a tool he could twist to suit his own purposes. Victoria stood frozen, her eyes locked on him as he entered. Her heart hammered in her chest, each beat sending a wave of anxiety and anger rushing through her. As Coleman's gaze finally landed on Jordan, something shifted in his demeanor. A small, cynical smirk played at the edges of his lips, one that spoke of condescension, not sympathy. It wasn't the smile of a man seeking justice or truth. It was the smile of someone who had already decided the outcome before the trial had even begun. It was the expression of someone who had made up his mind long ago and now simply needed the formalities of the courtroom to play out. Coleman took his seat with deliberate slowness, adjusting the folds of his black robe as if savoring the power he held over the room. Then, with a subtle clearing of his throat, he glanced at Jordan once more, his eyes never leaving him as he finally spoke. His voice rang out, dripping with sarcasm, his tone mocking and dismissive. "Let's get this over with," he said, his words cutting through the silence like a knife. "I don't have time to waste on cases like this." Victoria felt a cold rush of fury wash over her. Her fists clenched at her sides, but she kept her expression neutral, her face an impassive mask. She had known that this trial would not be fair. She had anticipated bias, but not this level of cruelty, this sheer disregard for justice. She had known that Coleman was a man who operated on power, not principle, but seeing it in action, the blatant disdain he had for her brother, for her family, made her blood boil. Her gaze flicked to Jordan, and her heart sank. His eyes were empty, devoid of hope, as if the fight had already been drained from him. The man who had once been full of life, whose spirit had always burned bright despite every obstacle, now sat there as though he had already surrendered. He had given up on the system, on the law, on the idea that there was anyone in this room who would truly fight for him. That look, that acceptance of his fate, was more devastating to Victoria than anything else. She had to keep it together. She couldn't let this injustice break her. She couldn't let the system win, not this time. But as she stood there, her mind raced. She was facing an uphill battle. Coleman, the prosecutor, the entire system, they were all against her, against Jordan. And yet, she knew she couldn't back down. She wouldn't back down. If they thought she would just sit by and watch them destroy her brother, they had gravely underestimated Victoria Hayes. This was her fight now, and she would move heaven and earth to make sure Jordan had a chance, no matter how crooked the system was, no matter how stacked the odds were against them. She wouldn't let her brother be another casualty of a broken system, not while she still had breath in her body. David Walker, the district prosecutor, stepped into the center of the courtroom with the confident air of an actor about to perform the greatest show of his career. He wasn't just any lawyer. He was a master storyteller, someone who knew how to bend the truth to craft the most convincing version of events. Dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, his tie neatly knotted, he briefly glanced at the jury before slowly speaking, his deep, persuasive voice filling the room. "Your Honor," Walker began, raising his hand slightly as if to emphasize each word he was about to say. "We are here today to shed light on a dangerous crime. The defendant, Jordan Thompson, engaged in acts of resistance against law enforcement, failing to comply with orders and endangering the lives of police officers and the surrounding public. The video footage clearly shows that the defendant not only refused to cooperate, but also displayed threatening behavior." Victoria felt a surge of anger rise inside her as she heard these words. She had watched that video countless times, analyzed each frame, every second. Jordan had not resisted. He had stood still, raised his hands just as the police had instructed. But within less than 2 seconds, one of the officers had shoved him to the ground, cuffed him, and restrained him. And now Walker was painting an entirely different picture, a picture in which Jordan was the troublemaker, the one who had brought this consequence upon himself. He continued, "The officers gave him numerous chances to comply, but instead of cooperating, the defendant chose to resist. Imagine for a moment being in the shoes of the officers on the scene. When faced with a subject who refuses to follow orders, they are forced to act to ensure their safety. This is not just about the defendant. It's about the safety of the community. Victoria's hands tightened into fists, so hard that her knuckles turned white. He was playing a psychological game. He didn't need the truth. He only needed to sow fear into the minds of the jury. A black man accused of resisting the police. A scenario far too familiar, too easy for everyone to believe without questioning the evidence. She glanced at the jury. Some nodded along to Walker's words, as if the story he was weaving made perfect sense. Others remained neutral, but in their eyes, she could see the hesitation. They were being led. Walker cleared his throat, then slowly turned toward Jordan. He walked over to the defendant's table, his gaze cold and calculating, as if he were assessing a wild animal trapped in a cage. "Defendant Jordan Thompson," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Jordan didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the table. It wasn't because he had nothing to say. It was because he knew that speaking wouldn't change a thing. Victoria gritted her teeth. If Jordan wouldn't speak, she would. If Walker thought he could manipulate this narrative without anyone fighting back, he had made a grave mistake. Judge Coleman flipped through the thick file in front of him with a disinterested air, as if this trial were nothing more than a tedious task he wanted to finish as quickly as possible. He leaned back in his chair, cleared his throat, and then spoke slowly, his voice dripping with disdain. "Does the defendant have representation?" His tone suggested that the question was merely a formality he had to fulfill, as though it held no real significance to him. No one stood. Jordan's court-appointed lawyer remained silent, head bowed, staring down at the stack of papers in front of him, avoiding the gaze of anyone in the room. Victoria knew that man wasn't a defender of justice. He was just a pawn in the system's game, a weak man unwilling to stand up to figures like Coleman or Walker. Victoria slowly stood up. Every eye in the courtroom turned toward her. "I am Victoria Hayes," she said, her voice firm and unwavering. "I am here to testify and defend my brother." The courtroom seemed to fall into a stunned silence for a brief moment before a ripple of whispers spread like wildfire. A woman, not a lawyer, without any legal standing, dared to step in and defend a defendant. This had never happened before. Coleman raised an eyebrow, looking at her as though she had just uttered something absurd. The defendant's sister? He tilted his head, a smirk curling at the edge of his lips. "Are you a lawyer?" Victoria didn't flinch. She locked eyes with him, unwavering, not a trace of fear in her expression. "I'm not a lawyer," she answered, her tone resolute. "But I know the law." The whispers grew louder. Several members of the jury exchanged glances, some shaking their heads. On the other side, Prosecutor David Walker crossed his arms over his chest, glaring at her with a look of challenge, as if he were waiting to see just how far she would push this. Coleman squinted, appraising her for a few seconds before letting out a derisive laugh. "You know the law? You think you can go up against people who have been enforcing the law for years just because you know the law?" He shook his head, his voice dripping with mockery. "Fine. You have 5 minutes." Victoria didn't respond to his sarcasm. She simply took a deep breath, steadying herself, keeping her sharp gaze fixed on him. 5 minutes is more than enough. If they thought she was just a woman here to beg for mercy, they had made a grave mistake. Judge Coleman crossed his arms in front of his chest, his cold, piercing gaze fixed directly on Victoria. He tilted his head as if appraising her once again, then slowly smirked, his voice dripping with mockery as it echoed through the silent courtroom. "So what do you think you can do? Change the truth?" His question cut through the tense air like a knife. A few people in the jury exchanged glances, while others lowered their heads as if contemplating something. Prosecutor David Walker stood next to him, arms crossed, watching Victoria with an amused expression, as if he were witnessing an amateur stepping into a game dominated by masters. But Victoria wasn't an amateur. Without missing a beat, she responded, her voice unwavering. "The truth is the one thing I don't need to change." The entire room fell silent. The whispers from moments before vanished completely. All that remained were the intense stares, an invisible but powerful tension filling the air. Judge Coleman stared at her for a long moment, his gaze darkening. Clearly, he hadn't expected such a direct challenge. He was used to holding control in the courtroom, used to people standing before him with bowed heads, too afraid to resist. But this woman was different. He let out a dismissive laugh, then slammed his hand down onto the wooden desk, the sound reverberating throughout the room. "Fine," he said, his voice still dripping with disdain, but now tinged with a hint of forced acknowledgement. "Prosecutor Walker, continue presenting your evidence." Walker cleared his throat, quickly regaining his composure. He straightened his tie, shooting a final glance at Victoria before walking toward the jury. She could see the smug satisfaction in his eyes, as though he believed the trial was still well within his control. Victoria took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. She knew this was just the beginning. If they thought she would be easily defeated, they were sorely mistaken. The real game was just starting. Victoria sat motionless in her chair, her hands tightly clasped together, holding back the fury that boiled inside her as Prosecutor Walker continued his rehearsed presentation. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting her mind drift back into the past, a memory that had never truly left her, a memory that haunted her every day. It had happened many years ago when Victoria was only 8. It was a scorching summer afternoon, the oppressive heat radiating off the cracked asphalt in their neighborhood. The sun beat down relentlessly, casting long shadows over the rundown houses that lined the street. Victoria could still hear the blaring siren of a police car, the sound so loud and jarring that it seemed to shake the very foundation of their home. Her mom had jumped, startled, and dropped the bucket she was washing out in the yard. Her father, Raymond Hayes, a Gulf War veteran, stood calmly watering the plants as he always did on summer days. He was a strong man, both physically and mentally, a man whose calm presence could always be counted on. His eyes, once filled with the quiet strength of a soldier who had seen the world at its worst, were now wide with shock. For the first time in Victoria's life, she saw fear in his eyes, and it terrified her. 3 police officers stepped out of the patrol car, their hands resting on their guns as if they were facing a dangerous criminal. The air was thick with tension, and Victoria's heart raced. Her father's posture shifted, becoming rigid as he turned to face them. This wasn't the man she knew, the calm, steady man who had taught her that justice would always prevail, that the law was something to be respected. Her mom rushed outside, panic in her voice. "What's going on?" she cried, her hands trembling as she clutched her apron. One officer, a white man with a faded scar on his cheek, pulled out a piece of paper from his jacket. "Raymond Hayes, you are under arrest for resisting an officer and threatening a police officer." The words felt like a punch to the gut. The room seemed to close in around Victoria, and for a moment, everything went still. Her mom's scream echoed in her ears, but she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The world outside didn't make sense anymore. Her father, a man who had never broken the law, never once raised his voice in anger, was being accused of something he would never do. She knew it wasn't true. He had never been a man of violence, only of quiet dignity. How could this be happening? Victoria's father stepped forward, trying to reason with them, his voice calm but firm. "This is a mistake," he said. "I've never resisted anyone. Can you tell me what I'm being accused of?" The officers didn't respond. They simply moved toward him, one of them grabbing his arms and forcibly cuffing him in front of Victoria. Her breath caught in her throat as she watched them, her small body shaking with disbelief. She watched as her father was shoved into the back of the patrol car, his face grim, his eyes locking onto hers. Her mom's cries cut through the air, her hands outstretched, desperate. "Raymond, what are they doing to you?" "It's okay," her father said, his voice strained but steady. "Everything will be all right, sweetheart." But Victoria knew it wasn't all right. It couldn't be. Days passed, and the weight of what had happened began to sink in. Late at night, when her mom thought she was asleep, Victoria overheard a conversation between her mother and the lawyer who had been assigned to help. She stood outside the door, her heart racing as she heard the words that shattered everything she had believed in. "This is a setup," the lawyer said, his voice filled with frustration. One of the officers started an altercation with Raymond at a grocery store. When Raymond asked for respect, they made a false accusation against him. Victoria felt the floor beneath her give way, her world crumbling. Her mom's voice, choked with emotion, followed. "What can we do? How do we fight this?" The lawyer's response was as harsh as it was final. "Nothing. They are the police. Their word holds more weight than any evidence we could ever gather. In that moment, Victoria learned the most painful truth of her life. Justice wasn't about truth. It wasn't about fairness or right or wrong. Justice was a tool wielded by those with power, and those without power, like her father, would never win. Her father was sentenced to 6 months in prison for a crime he didn't commit. During that time, Victoria saw her mother's spirit wither. She watched her cry night after night as every appeal was denied, as every attempt to seek justice for her father failed. When her father was finally released, he was a shell of the man he once was. He was quieter, more withdrawn, his eyes hollow, as if something inside him had died during those 6 months. And then, a few months later, he left. He left the family, unable to bear the weight of the world anymore, unable to live with the shame of a system that had broken him. That was the moment Victoria's hatred for the system began to grow, for a system that had taken her father's dignity and shattered it into pieces. She swore deep in her heart that one day she would stand up to it. One day she would fight back against a world that cared nothing for the truth. Jordan and Victoria grew up in the same house, enduring the same pain, witnessing the same injustice their father had suffered. But instead of allowing the past to destroy them, each chose a different path, two opposing directions, yet both aimed at one common goal: not to be crushed by this system. Jordan, though branded by society, never let hatred overpower his reasoning. He believed that if he lived a good life, if he followed all the rules, the system could no longer harm him. He worked hard, stayed away from trouble, never argued or confronted the police, and even believed that if he gave them no reason to suspect him, they would leave him alone. He chose silence and patience, believing that eventually, things would get better. But Victoria couldn't accept that. She couldn't bear the idea of bowing her head in exchange for peace. She had witnessed her father being thrown into prison for something he didn't do. She had seen her mom plead, ignored by everyone. She had lived through childhood with a constant fear every time a police car passed by their neighborhood, and she swore she would never allow herself to become a victim. Instead of accepting it, Victoria fought back. She studied the law, researched the justice system, and learned how those in power manipulated the laws to protect themselves. She didn't want to be just a lawyer, bound by the rules of the court. She wanted to understand the law, to be able to defeat the system that had destroyed her family. She and Jordan were two people, two paths, two completely different approaches to life. But in the end, no matter how hard Jordan tried to live honorably, the system found a way to push him to the bottom. And as he was handcuffed and dragged into this courtroom, Victoria knew she had been right. She knew that the only way to survive in this world was to fight. Victoria had lived her life preparing for this moment. She had made a vow when she was young, watching the life drain from her father's spirit, that she would not allow the system to destroy her or anyone she loved. Jordan had chosen to believe in the system's fairness, but she knew better. She had seen firsthand how easily it could fail. As she sat in this courtroom, watching Jordan's eyes, so much like her father's, she realized just how far she had come. Jordan had hoped that by being good, by following the rules, the system would let him be. But the truth was, it never worked that way. The system wasn't made for people like them. It wasn't made for the ones who didn't have the power to manipulate it. Victoria was ready now. She wouldn't let the system win again, not this time. This time, she would be the one who turned the tide. This time, she would fight, not just for Jordan, but for everyone who had been silenced by the same broken system. The fight wasn't just about her brother anymore. It was about every single person who had ever been crushed under the weight of injustice. And she would make sure they knew, loud and clear, that she was not backing down. Victoria had once watched a man as strong as her father get crushed by the system. She had seen him walk into prison as a respected veteran and walk out as a mere shadow of himself. He was no longer the man she had once known. The sharp eyes that used to see everything clearly had become hollow. His once warm voice now filled with exhaustion and bitterness. She still remembered the nights he stayed awake, sitting alone in the living room with a glass of whiskey in hand, the streetlights casting long shadows across his brooding face. He had fought for his country, but when he came home, he couldn't win against the very system that had put him behind bars over a false accusation. Eventually, he left the family, taking with him not only his disappointment, but also scars that could never be erased. And now, history was repeating itself with Jordan. She had always hoped that if Jordan took a different path, if he stayed out of trouble, if he followed the rules, the system would never touch him. But she had been wrong. It didn't matter if he was a good person or not, because from the moment he stepped out of the house with his skin color, he had already become a target. She couldn't let Jordan suffer the same fate their father had. Victoria knew exactly what would happen if she didn't act. The justice system didn't need evidence. It only needed a convincing story to make the jury believe in Jordan's guilt. She knew how they manipulated the truth, how they exploited loopholes in the law to protect the powerful and crush people like her family. She also knew that if this case were allowed to pass as just another trial, Jordan would become another statistic, a black man wrongly convicted, another life destroyed. Judge Coleman would deliver the sentence with his usual indifference. Prosecutor Walker would pat himself on the back for completing his task, and soon everyone would forget about Jordan as if nothing had ever happened. But Victoria wasn't going to let that happen. She looked at her brother, seeing the reflection of their father in his eyes. But this time, she wasn't a helpless child standing behind a door watching the police cuff her father. This time, she would stand up. This time, she would fight. And she would not lose. The fight was no longer just about saving her brother. It was about reclaiming everything that had been taken from them, from their family. It was about breaking the chains of a system designed to oppress. No longer would she let fear dictate her actions. No longer would she stand by and watch others get crushed. Victoria knew that the battle ahead would be long, that the road would be tough. But she also knew that if she didn't fight now, they would never stop. And for the first time in years, she felt the fire of determination burning in her chest. This was her moment to take control. She wasn't just fighting for justice. She was fighting for the memory of her father, for the future of her brother, and for every person who had ever been silenced or ignored by the system. This time, she would make sure they heard her. And this time, she would win. Victoria blinked, pulling herself away from the painful memories and back into the present. The sterile, cold air of the courtroom seemed to press in on her, suffocating, as if the room itself was holding its breath. The walls seemed to close in around her, echoing with the sense of inevitability that had been building for hours. Jordan's fate had almost been sealed before the trial even began. From the moment the charges were laid out, she had known this was a charade, a carefully orchestrated spectacle where justice was nothing more than an illusion. She shifted her gaze once again, focusing on Prosecutor David Walker, whose voice continued to flow with practiced ease, unbroken, almost mechanical. The defendant, Jordan Thompson, represents a threat to public safety. He continued, weaving his narrative with chilling precision. He resisted arrest, refused to comply, and escalated a situation that should have been handled peacefully. His words felt rehearsed, as though they had been sculpted into a perfect line meant to convince the jury that Jordan was something he was not. There was no remorse in his eyes, no sense of concern for truth, only cold calculation. Walker didn't even spare a glance at Jordan. He wasn't interested in the man sitting across from him. No, his only goal was the end game. He was using Jordan as a pawn in a game far larger than any of them understood. Every word that left his lips was an attack, a well-aimed strike designed to embed fear in the hearts of the jury, to make them believe Jordan was dangerous, beyond redemption. His story wasn't about the truth. It was about crafting a version of events that would resonate with the fears of those watching. Victoria's eyes moved across the courtroom, searching for any signs of weakness, any cracks in the facade they were building. Her gaze lingered on the jury. Some of them were nodding, their faces frozen in serious contemplation. But there was something unsettling about their expressions. They weren't just passive listeners. No, there was something more, a sense of anticipation, like they were being slowly guided toward a conclusion they hadn't even realized they were being led to. As she observed them, a chill ran down her spine. Something was off. A few members of the jury were no longer just passively listening. They were already swaying in Walker's direction, their eyes narrowed, lips set in grim lines. Their attention was fixed on Walker with an intensity that spoke volumes. But when Jordan's lawyer tried to speak, to defend him, they seemed almost bored. A couple of jurors didn't even seem to be paying attention. Their eyes glazed over as if they had already made up their minds. It wasn't just disinterest. It was a carefully controlled indifference, as if they had been instructed to ignore anything that didn't fit the narrative they were being fed. Then a realization hit her like a bolt of lightning. The jury had been selected carefully. This wasn't a random process. She knew the selection procedure inside out. It was meant to be impartial. But Victoria had seen it before. She knew how the system worked, how jurors could be weeded out, how the right people could be put in place, people whose biases, whether subconscious or not, could be manipulated. If the prosecution wanted a conviction, they didn't need to rely on evidence. They could sway the jury through subtle manipulation, through carefully chosen words, images, and emotions. And that's exactly what was happening. Walker was exploiting the weaknesses of the jury. He was using their natural fears, their unconscious biases, to build a story where Jordan was the villain. They had been primed to believe it, primed to see him as the enemy. Her eyes drifted to Judge Richard Coleman. His demeanor was as expected, apathetic, distant, almost as if he were a spectator in his own courtroom. The impartiality of the court was supposed to rest in his hands, but Victoria knew better. Coleman was no neutral figure. From the moment the trial started, he had dismissed every objection raised by Jordan's lawyer, allowing Walker to lead the charge without any real challenge. He had created an environment where the prosecution had the upper hand, where every twist and turn of the trial bent to their will. Victoria could feel the weight of his gaze as it swept over her, but there was no compassion in his eyes. There was no justice in him. She had known from the moment he entered the room that this trial was doomed to fail, that this wasn't about truth, it was about power. Her fists clenched, her mind racing with the truth that was now undeniable. This wasn't a trial. This was a performance, and the verdict had already been written. Victoria's thoughts began to move faster, her pulse quickening. She had known this day would come. She had feared it, had dreaded it. But now that she was here, sitting in the courtroom, watching everything unfold, she realized how deep the corruption ran. This wasn't just about one trial. It was about a system that had been rigged from the start. It was about a game where the innocent were always the losers, where the powerful always won. But she wasn't going to let them win, not this time. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, her mind shifting focus, shifting into high gear. She had prepared for this moment her entire life. It was time to break the pattern, to disrupt the chessboard they had set up. If she didn't do something now, Jordan would become another statistic, a faceless victim in a long line of casualties at the hands of a broken system. And that was something she couldn't allow. Her gaze locked onto the jury again. She could feel the weight of the eyes on her, some skeptical, some indifferent, but others seemed to be waiting for something. What was it? She had been in this courtroom long enough to sense it. Something was about to shift, but it wasn't going to be easy. Victoria knew this fight would be a battle of wits, a battle of manipulation, and she was ready to play. This wasn't just about defending her brother anymore. It was about exposing the lies, the falsehoods, and the corruption that ran so deeply within this system. It was about breaking free from the chains that had bound her family for so long. The stakes were higher now. This was her moment to expose everything. With each passing second, the room seemed to close in tighter, the tension rising, thick and suffocating. Victoria could almost hear her own heartbeat as it pounded in her ears. The battle wasn't just in front of her, it was all around her, and it was one she couldn't afford to lose. And she wouldn't. Victoria clenched her fists, the sharp sting of her nails digging into her palms, the pain a bitter reminder of her growing fury. Judge Coleman had been biased from the start. From the very first moment the trial began, he made no effort to conceal his partiality. Every decision was made in favor of Prosecutor Walker. When Jordan's defense attorney attempted to object to the baseless claims made by the prosecution, Coleman simply raised his hand dismissively, his voice cold and uninterested. Objection denied. Proceed, Prosecutor Walker. No thought, no consideration. As if the defense's objections were nothing more than noise in a game where the outcome had already been decided. Victoria had been watching closely. When Walker made absurd claims, such as Jordan threatening an officer, Jordan's lawyer immediately stood to object, pointing out that there was no evidence to support such an accusation. But Coleman merely shook his head, his voice as cold as ice. Objection without merit. Proceed, prosecutor. But when Jordan's lawyer sought to present a video showing that Jordan had surrendered immediately, raising his hands in compliance when approached by the officers, Coleman swiftly raised his hand. This evidence is irrelevant. Objection sustained. Victoria felt a rush of anger burn through her chest. How could such crucial evidence be dismissed like that? The video clearly showed Jordan raising his hands in surrender, yet the police attacked him anyway. She looked toward the jury. Some members seemed to be wavering, but when they saw Coleman's indifferent response, they began to accept his guidance. Coleman didn't need to declare Jordan guilty. He only needed to steer the jury into believing it. Every time Walker made an emotional, vague argument, Coleman let it pass without question. But whenever the defense tried to counter, he immediately shut them down. Victoria realized with a clarity that made her blood run cold that this wasn't just an unfair trial. This was a hunt, and Jordan was the prey, cornered by a system rigged against him. The ones in power were standing above, pulling the strings, manipulating everything according to their whims. She ground her teeth, her mind racing with the cold, brutal truth. If they thought she would sit idly by while her brother was devoured by this system, they were gravely mistaken. She was done watching from the sidelines. She had been silent for too long. It wasn't just Jordan's future on the line. It was everything her family had fought for. She had seen this game before, had felt the sting of injustice and betrayal in her own life, and she would not let them get away with it again. She stood up slowly, her eyes locked on the judge, then on the prosecutor, the defense attorney, and finally the jury. Her heart pounded in her chest, but there was no hesitation now. She wasn't just here to watch. She was here to fight, to make them see the truth. Victoria knew that if she wanted to save Jordan, she had to do something bold. The stakes were high, and if she didn't act now, they would make sure he was swallowed whole by a system that only cared about power. But she wasn't going to let that happen. She would stand tall, and she would make them listen. The court was rigged, the jury was swayed, but Victoria Hayes wasn't about to let them win. Not this time. Victoria's gaze turned to the person who should have been Jordan's only true ally in this courtroom, the defense attorney. But instead of seeing someone ready to fight for justice, she saw a man who seemed weak, a puppet controlled by the system. Jordan's attorney, Ethan Palmer, was a young man, perhaps just in his early 30s. His suit was slightly too big for him, the tie hanging loosely as if he had hastily thrown it on without time for adjustments. But what bothered Victoria most wasn't his appearance. It was his attitude. Throughout the trial, as Prosecutor Walker made his baseless claims, Palmer rarely objected. He simply sat there, flipping through the papers in front of him as though searching for something but not knowing what to do with it. Every time Victoria thought he might stand up, he hesitated, only to do nothing at all. Then, when he finally did object, his reaction was so weak that no one even bothered to pay attention. "Your Honor, I object." His voice was so soft it was almost inaudible. Coleman looked up, raising an eyebrow in disdain. "On what grounds?" Palmer glanced nervously at Walker, then back at his desk. "I just think this argument lacks evidence." "Objection denied," Coleman replied, cutting him off. Prosecutor Walker, continue. Victoria bit her lip, fighting to keep her composure. What the hell was Palmer doing? He wasn't arguing, he wasn't fighting, he wasn't defending Jordan. He was just sitting there like a scared student who had been reprimanded by the teacher and didn't dare speak up. She glanced over at Jordan. Her brother was noticing the same thing. His expression had shifted. He wasn't angry anymore. He was filled with despair. She understood. Jordan had known from the start that he had no chance of winning. When he was arrested, he was appointed a public defender. But public defender didn't mean someone who would fight for him. It only meant another pawn of the system, a person assigned to make everything seem legal while in reality, they had no intention of standing against the forces controlling the trial. Victoria took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. If Palmer couldn't stand up and fight, then she would. She wasn't a lawyer, but she knew the law, and more importantly, she knew how to fight. If they thought she would sit back and let this trial unfold according to the script they had written, then they had severely underestimated Victoria Hayes. Her mind began to race with plans, strategies. The system had its puppets, but she wasn't one of them. If Palmer couldn't speak up for her brother, then she would. She wasn't about to let Jordan be crushed under this rigged system, not while she had breath in her body. She had always known this day would come, the day when she would have to step into the ring, not as a bystander, but as someone who would fight for what was right. Now that it had arrived, Victoria knew she wasn't just fighting for Jordan. She was fighting for the very idea of justice, the justice that had been denied to her father and the justice that was being taken from her brother now. It was time for her to take action. Victoria's fists tightened, feeling the pressure building in her chest as her breath quickened. She had sat still for too long, witnessed far too much injustice unfolding before her eyes. If she didn't act now, Jordan wouldn't have any chance of defending himself. She glanced around the courtroom, quickly evaluating the situation. Walker was in control, Coleman was aiding the manipulation, and Palmer, Jordan's attorney, was nothing more than a useless puppet. If she let this trial continue down this path, they would convict Jordan before he could even make a real defense. Taking a deep breath, she stood up abruptly. The courtroom fell into immediate silence. Every eye in the room turned toward her. Coleman furrowed his brow, irritation clear in his expression. "What are you doing, Miss Hayes?" Victoria held his gaze, unshaken. "I can't sit idly by while this trial is being so blatantly manipulated." Walker sneered, folding his arms across his chest. "You're not a lawyer. You have no right to speak in this trial." Victoria locked eyes with him, her gaze like ice. "Then tell me, Prosecutor Walker, are you going to let the jury hear the truth or just the story you've scripted for them?" A murmur rippled through the courtroom. A few members of the jury exchanged uncertain glances. Victoria knew she had just planted a seed of doubt in their minds. Coleman slammed his hand on the desk, trying to regain control of the situation. "You're disrupting the trial, Ms. Hayes. I demand that you sit down immediately." But Victoria didn't budge. She stared at the judge with a piercing gaze. "Your Honor, I am not disrupting. I'm just ensuring that this trial isn't a prearranged performance." The air in the courtroom had grown taut as a violin string. The jury was starting to feel that something was off. Victoria took a deep breath and pressed further into the confrontation. "If you truly believe Jordan is guilty, why do you keep dismissing every piece of evidence that could exonerate him? If this trial is truly fair, why are you allowing Prosecutor Walker to manipulate the jury with baseless accusations?" The room seemed frozen. A few jurors nodded subtly, as if they were beginning to realize something. Coleman's jaw tightened, his face turning red with fury. "You do not have the right to cross-examine me. This is a court, not your personal lecture." Victoria's lips curled into a wry smile. "That's true, Your Honor. But let's ensure that justice is actually served properly." She knew that she had just struck at the heart of the system's weakness. By forcing them to confront the reality of what was happening, she had shaken their absolute control. She didn't need to be a lawyer to expose the truth, and now she had started to turn the tide. Victoria's hands tightened into fists, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The weight of the moment was suffocating. She had waited for this, for the opportunity to stand up not as a passive observer, but as someone who would take control of the situation. This courtroom, this trial, had been carefully orchestrated, but now it was time for the puppet strings to snap. No one in this room expected a woman like her to challenge the power of Judge Coleman and Prosecutor Walker, but they were wrong. She wasn't just standing up, she was ready to tear their play apart. Slowly, she stepped forward, each footfall echoing in the hushed silence of the courtroom. Her eyes locked onto Coleman, the man sitting behind the bench with his cold, unyielding face. "Your Honor, I have a few questions for you," she spoke, her voice calm but laden with calculation. "Why is it that every piece of evidence in Jordan's favor has been dismissed? Why is it that the jury is only hearing what Prosecutor Walker wants them to hear? Is this a trial, or just a play that you and Walker have scripted from the beginning?" The air in the courtroom became thick with tension. Walker raised an eyebrow, his expression flickering with uncertainty for the first time. Coleman, though still maintaining his stern facade, shifted slightly in his seat, his eyes narrowing as though he too sensed something shifting in the room. "You have no right to ask questions in this trial," Coleman said, his voice heavy with irritation but lacking its usual confidence. "Sit down now." But Victoria didn't move. "If I don't have the right to ask questions, then who does?" she shot back, her voice low but sharp, piercing the stillness like a blade. "Justice cannot be manipulated by a biased judge and a deceitful prosecutor. If you truly believe in your verdict, why are you afraid to answer me?" Her words cut through the courtroom, sending shock waves through the air. The jury shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some exchanging glances, the seeds of doubt beginning to take root in their minds. Walker turned sharply, clearing his throat, trying to regain his composure. "Ms. Hayes, this is not the place for you to lecture about justice," he said, his tone strained, no longer as confident as before. But Victoria stood her ground, unwavering. A slight smile tugged at the corners of her lips as her eyes gleamed with a new sense of purpose. "Then let me show you something," she said, her voice steady as she reached into her jacket pocket. The room held its breath as she pulled out a black leather wallet, holding it firmly in her hand. All eyes in the courtroom shifted to her, the tension thickening, the air practically crackling with anticipation. She opened the wallet, and in that instant, the room fell into an absolute silence. The light from the overhead bulbs gleamed off the badge inside, the bold, unmistakable emblem of the U.S. Secret Service. A hush descended. Walker froze in place, his eyes wide with disbelief. A few jurors' mouths fell open in shock. But the most telling reaction came from Coleman. Just moments ago, sitting in his seat with all the arrogance of a man who controlled everything. Now his face drained of color as if he had just realized a grave mistake. Victoria allowed herself a moment to let the impact sink in. She could feel the weight of their stunned silence as she slowly surveyed the room, her gaze sweeping across every face in the courtroom, each one stunned by the truth she had just revealed. "Let me introduce myself," she said, her voice calm but imbued with an undeniable authority. "I am Agent Victoria Hayes, U.S. Secret Service. I don't just know the law. I'm here to protect real justice, not the twisted version of it you've been trying to sell in this room." The room seemed to hold its breath. Victoria could see the muscles in Coleman's jaw twitch as he tried to mask his panic. Walker stood motionless, clearly unsure of how to respond. The game they had carefully constructed, the play they had worked so hard to stage, was now crumbling before their eyes. Coleman swallowed hard, trying to hold on to whatever authority he had left, but his hand gripped the desk so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "Agent Hayes," he spoke, but his voice no longer carried the weight it once had. "I don't see how your identity is relevant to this trial." Victoria smiled thinly, stepping forward just a fraction, claiming her space in the room. "Oh, I think it's more relevant than you realize," she replied, her gaze cutting through the tension like a blade. "Because I'm not just standing here as a witness. I'm someone who holds the truth in my hands, and I will not let anyone in this courtroom, neither you nor Walker, conceal that truth." The room remained deathly silent. No one moved, no one dared speak. In that moment, Victoria was no longer the oppressed woman fighting against a corrupt system. She was the one in control. Every eye was on her, and the weight of the moment settled heavily on the shoulders of everyone in the room. They had underestimated her, but now she had set the stage. It was no longer a matter of manipulation. It was a matter of truth. And truth, no matter how hard they tried to suppress it, had a way of breaking free. The air in the courtroom was suffocating, thick with tension. What had started as a carefully crafted performance, orchestrated by Prosecutor Walker and Judge Coleman, now felt like it was slowly unraveling. The jury, once skeptical of Jordan, was beginning to waver. Victoria could see the change in their faces. Some looked down at their notes. Others exchanged glances with one another, their brows furrowing in confusion and doubt. They had been swept up in Walker's narrative, but now, with the stark reality laid before them, the truth was impossible to ignore. A middle-aged man in the front row furrowed his brow, a thoughtful look on his face as he processed every word Victoria had spoken. An older woman beside him gave a small nod, her gaze intense and contemplative. These were the same people who had seemed like mere pawns in the game of the system, but now something was shifting in them. They were beginning to question the narrative they had been fed, to see the cracks in the perfect picture the prosecution had painted. Victoria knew that she could not stop here. She had made an impact, but this was far from over. She needed to push, to demand answers. She took another bold step forward, her voice resonating through the courtroom with a piercing clarity. Every word she spoke was designed to dismantle the lies, to show the jury that this trial was no longer about guilt or innocence. It was about truth. We've all seen what's happened. All the evidence that could have cleared Jordan has been dismissed without reason or merit. I ask you, if Jordan is truly guilty, why are Prosecutor Walker and Judge Coleman doing everything they can to silence those who speak the truth? Her gaze flicked to Walker. The room fell even quieter, if that was possible. Victoria's eyes locked onto his, and she felt him flinch almost imperceptibly. She had him now. She turned toward Coleman, her voice colder, sharper. Why the glaring discrepancy between the police testimony and the video footage? If justice truly exists in this courtroom, why do you fear the truth when it's laid bare for all to see? The room was completely still. The entire courtroom seemed to freeze in place, the heavy weight of her words hanging in the air. The jury was silent. Some of them were still, their faces inscrutable, but others shifted in their seats, the faintest signs of doubt creeping into their expressions. A few looked to one another, exchanging silent glances as if the foundation of their certainty was starting to crack. Coleman's face was a mask of disdain, but Victoria could see the nervous tension in his posture, the subtle shift in his seat. His hands tightened on the edge of the desk, his fingers white with the pressure. His voice, once so certain, now wavered just slightly. "You have no right to question me, Ms. Hayes," he snapped, trying to regain control. "Sit down now." But Victoria didn't move. She stood there, unyielding, her eyes locked on him. "If I don't have the right to ask questions, then who does?" Her voice was low but sharp enough to cut through the growing tension. "Justice cannot be manipulated by a biased judge and a dishonest prosecutor. If you truly believe in your verdict, why are you afraid to answer me?" Her words struck like a dagger, slicing through the layers of manipulation and deceit. The room was vibrating with the weight of what she had just exposed. The whispers began, the quiet murmurings of a jury that was starting to see the cracks in the facade. Victoria could feel the change. The tide was turning. The jury wasn't buying what Walker and Coleman were selling anymore. Walker shifted uncomfortably, his face a mask of anger and surprise. He stood straighter, trying to regain some of the authority he had lost. "Ms. Hayes, this is not the place for you to lecture us on justice," he said, his voice much less assured than it had been moments before. Victoria didn't back down. Her lips curled into a small, knowing smile as she took a step closer. "Then let me show you something," she said calmly, her tone icy with authority. She reached into her jacket pocket slowly, deliberately. The entire room held its breath. What was she doing? The moment she pulled out the black leather wallet, the tension in the air snapped. The sharp sound of the wallet opening echoed across the room. The light caught the emblem inside, and for a brief moment, time seemed to stop. The U.S. Secret Service badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights. A stunned silence filled the courtroom. Walker froze in place, his eyes wide with shock. A few of the jurors gasped, their mouths dropping open. The change in the atmosphere was palpable. The smug faces of those in power were gone, replaced by the stunned realization of what they had been caught in. Coleman's face drained of color, his hands, once steady, now trembled slightly. He tried to maintain control, but the crack in his facade was evident to everyone in the room. Victoria didn't wait for them to recover. "Let me introduce myself," she said, her voice calm, but with the authority of someone who had the full weight of the law behind them. "I am Agent Victoria Hayes, U.S. Secret Service. I don't just know the law. I'm here to protect true justice, not the twisted version of it you've been trying to peddle in this courtroom." The room was silent. The weight of her words settled heavily on every single person in the room. No one dared speak. Victoria could see the flicker of panic in Coleman's eyes, the tight grip he had on the desk as he tried to maintain the control that was slipping from his grasp. Walker, for the first time in the trial, seemed speechless. The illusion they had crafted was crumbling before their eyes. Coleman tried to recover, his voice tight and shaky. "Agent Hayes," he said, but there was no authority in his words now. "I don't see how your identity is relevant to this trial." Victoria smiled coldly, stepping forward just enough to fully occupy the space. "Oh, I think it's far more relevant than you realize," she replied, her gaze piercing. "Because I'm not just standing here as a witness. I'm someone who holds the truth in my hands, and I will not let anyone in this courtroom, neither you nor Walker, obscure that truth." The room was frozen in place. No one moved. The silence was thick, oppressive. In that moment, Victoria wasn't just an observer of justice. She was the one enforcing it. The system that had trapped so many, that had torn her family apart, was now on the brink of collapse. The power had shifted, and now Victoria Hayes was in control. The courtroom, once dominated by Coleman and Walker's manipulations, was now firmly in her hands. And she knew this was only the beginning. Stay tuned for the next part. What will happen after the trial? Hit subscribe so you don't miss the shocking twists to come.